Now, if we put Teresa Deevy, take Teresa Deevy, we put her in that culture of the 1930s, this culture of talk and of drink and of a sort of conviviality, there are two things to note. First of all, she was a woman, a respectable, middle-class, fairly religiously devout woman. And the Irish pub at that time was very much a male preserve. Up until even the 1980s, there were pubs that would only serve women in what was euphemistically called the lounge. They would have two parts, the lounge and the bar. That women, there were some old pubs that wouldn't serve women in the bar. That was fairly common in the 1930s. So, as a woman, she wouldn't really have had access to that world of kind of male conviviality. The other thing was, though, of course, this world of the pub and of pub talk was a world. It was a world in which words were used like weapons. You know, it was a world of wit and of sharp repartee. And having a hearing impairment, she would have had a very difficult time in that world as well. So there was a sense in which, while she was gregarious on one level, her letters show that she's constantly making contact with people, she's interested in people, she wants to make contact with people, she was always left out, she was always on the outside of the cut and thrust of the kind of daily conversation of the literary world of Ireland at the time. One of the things that comes across in her letters is she's constantly trying to make connections with people that she admires in the world of Dublin's letters at the time, to meet them one-on-one. Here's a letter she wrote in 1955, actually just before the only stage production of Wife to James Whelan, to what was probably the leading Irish critic at the time, a man named John Jordan. And she writes this to him. She'd met him in a social gathering just before, but she now wants to meet him one-on-one. And she says this: "It is easier for a person, when with me, to be the only one. For then one doesn't mind so much to repeat, or better still, for me to write. You did not appear to mind, yet I was reluctant to hold up the general conversation by asking you lots of things that would have been good to discuss with you." You get this sense of a yearning for contact, and yet a sense that when she's in company, for her it's very, very difficult, because it's a world that doesn't make a lot of allowances for people with a hearing impairment. The other thing that comes across with Teresa Deevy's letters is a sense of geographical isolation. She was born in Waterford. She lived most of her life off and on in Waterford, which is several hundred miles to the south of Dublin. Again, her letters are full of attempts to set up meetings with people, but they're always hampered by the fact that she's usually on her way to Waterford. Here she is writing to John Jordan again. "Well," she says, "about our confab, I think I'll have to postpone it until after Christmas. I go to Waterford next Thursday to spend Christmas with my people there." She's constantly missing people in her correspondence. She says, I'll meet you, but I'm going to Waterford. So there's this sense of geographically, she's also isolated, cut off from people. I want to try and kind of bring these sort of things together to think about the ways in which her plays, and particularly Wife to James Whelan, works. This sense of being behind, as I said, the wall of glass, being cut off behind the studio with a wall of glass. One of the things that certainly would have made Teresa Deevy feel on the outside for a lot of her career was that from about 1939 onwards, the Abbey turned its back on her. Now, I think it's worth just looking at this just for a few minutes. Those of you who saw the play that was here last year by Lennox Robinson, Is Life Worth Living, would have seen a play from the Abbey from 1933. It's a play about a group of actors, traveling group of actors, who arrive in an Irish seaside town with a repertoire of Strindberg and Ibsen and Tolstoy, and they decide that they're going to change the lives of the people in this Irish seaside town by putting on these plays. And it's funny. It is a very funny play. There's a character in the play who's this larger-than-life actor-manager, Hector Delamere. It's played beautifully here by Kevin Kilner. And at one point, he announces what he's going to do. He says, "We may revolutionize some young person's life." And there's one of the Irish characters turns to him and says, sure, we've had enough of revolutions. And in a sense, that was very much the feeling in Ireland in the 1930s. We've had enough of revolutions. There's a slightly later Irish play called Twilight of the Warrior, where there's a character that says, the dream is watered down. The patriots are becoming politicians. That's what was starting to happen in the Abbey Theatre in the 30s. The patriots were becoming politicians. The Abbey had been founded by writers, by Yeats, Lady Gregory, and Synge. In the 1930s, well, Lady Gregory died 32, Yeats died in 1939, the theatre was put under the management of a former Minister for Finance, a man named Ernest Blythe. And there was very much a sense of pulling back from the sort of idealistic beginnings of the theatre. There are a lot of very bitter writings about the Abbey at this point. One account of the Abbey, written in 1950 by a man named Peter Kavanagh, concludes with these words. It says, in 1939, when Yeats died, the Abbey died. The Abbey Theatre was a dream in the mind of Yeats. When he died, the reality returned to the dream and passed away with its creator. Now, that was premature. The Abbey is still very much alive today. But there was a sense in the 30s that the Abbey was dying on its feet. And Teresa Deevy felt this as well. Here's a letter she wrote to her friend Florence Hackett in 1935. She says, something will have to be done about the theatre in Ireland. It's appalling. Later, she recounts a conversation she had had with Frank O'Connor, the Irish writer. She says, Frank O'Connor says the Abbey is finished, but I don't agree. He says the new changes are no good. It's only a matter of time. He talks of a new theatre, but where's the money to come from? Now, what happens in the mid-30s with Teresa Deevy is she gets caught up in a power struggle in the Abbey. That we have this Minister for Finance, or former Minister for Finance, running a theatre that had been founded by a group of idealistic writers. Deevy herself, like the character of Nan Bowers in Wife to James Whelan, was not somebody who would knuckle under to authority, and particularly to male authority. In the 30s, she wrote letters to the Irish Times complaining or protesting about the Irish censorship that was taking place at the time. Here's one letter she wrote in 1936. Who are the censors, she says? By what right do they hold office? And, in case of proved incompetence, how can they be removed? Now, this is not the sort of thing that is going to endear her to a kind of career civil servant, well, career politician, become civil servant, who's now running the National Theatre. So what happens is, after that extraordinary run of plays that I mentioned earlier, from 1930 until 36, she has, almost a play a year. The Abbey drops her. They drop her like a hot potato. There's a play called Holiday House that the Abbey accepted in 1939, issued a contract, and never staged. And in her letters, she says whenever she tried to ask why, she was given what she was called evasive answers. Here's a letter that she writes again to her friend Florence Hackett, talking about the play that's going to be on here this afternoon, Wife to James Whelan. She says, Blythe's letter, when returning it, showed clearly that he has no use for my work. Never asked to see any more. It may be a good thing to be finished with the Abbey, yet I love the Abbey, and their actors are fine. Now, when I start to wonder, what was it then that caused the Abbey to turn against Teresa Deevy? I think it was partly, as I say, she got caught in a political crossfire. But there was something else, and this is what I want to kind of circle in on this morning. There was a character in her, or a characteristic in her plays that I think many of her contemporaries found made them very uncomfortable. The leading theatre reviewer in Ireland in the 1930s was a man named Gabriel Fallon. Fallon had been an actor. He had been in the original production of Sean O'Casey's Ploughing the Stars in 1926. After he became an actor, he became a reviewer, and as time went on, he became an increasingly grumpy reviewer. And here he is reviewing the published edition of Deevy's plays in 1940. And here's what he writes about Teresa Deevy. He says that in his view, her plays are lacking in dramatic plausibility. And here's the advice he gives her. A little more objectivity might help Miss Deevy to attain it. This is Gabriel Fallon's view, one has to see the world stage in order to bring it home to men's bosoms in the theatre. One needs to be a little bit more detached from one's characters than Miss Deevy seems to be in order to do that. Now, as I say, Fallon was notoriously grumpy, but there's an interesting perception here. he sees Deevy's plays as being very subjective, very much about inner states of consciousness, not as something seen from the outside. Now let me put that in the context of the kinds of things that were being said in Ireland at the time. In 1941, a year after this review was published, a critic named Sean O'Fallon started a magazine called The Bell. And here was the manifesto he wrote for the generation of Irish writers in the 1940s. He says, "Ireland is young in earnest. She knows that somewhere, amid the briars and the brambles, there stands the reality which the generations died to reach. Not, you notice, the ideal. Our generation is too sober," literally they weren't, "to talk much about ideals." Reality. Most of the major writers of this period, the 1940s, are realists. They're interested in the surface of life, what life looks like objectively from the outside. I think that what a lot of critics saw in Teresa Deevy's work was work that was mainly concerned with what was going on inside the characters' heads, in their subjective states of consciousness. Here's a review of the play Temporal Powers, the one that the Mint is going to be doing next year, when it was originally produced in 1932. The reviewer says, "Miss Teresa Deevy has written an original and thought-provoking play. Throughout the performance, one is haunted by the feeling of some unfamiliar quality in the atmosphere." Some unfamiliar quality in the atmosphere. That's what you'll see here this afternoon. A sense that what we're looking at looks like the world as well as it would really be represented, but there's something else going on there that we're producing a kind of state of mind. Let me give you an example by just talking a little bit about one of her plays. A play called The King of Spain's Daughter, which again, Mint's going to do, I think, a rehearsed reading here on September 19th. Is that
Correct.
right, Jonathan? Yeah. On September 19th, there'll be a rehearsed reading of this play here on the stage. The King of Spain's Daughter takes place on a stage where there's a road, and at the back of the road there's a sign that says "Road Closed." It's a one-act play, and we have a character there called Annie Kinsella. And Annie is given a choice, really a choice of two things in life, of working in a factory or marrying a man, Jim Harris, who she really doesn't appear to love. There's no real interest in. It's a kind of no choice, and the sign "Road Closed" is really kind of sums it up. What makes the play fascinating is while we see the character in this dilemma, and her state of mind is intimated to us, we never really know what it is she's thinking. Does she really feel anything for Jim Harris? There are times where she doesn't seem to remember what she'd done the night before. And at the end of the play, after seeing his fairly meager bank savings, she decides to marry him. And here's what she says in the curtain. She says, "He put by 2 shillings for 200 weeks. I think he's a man that, supposing he was jealous, might cut your throat." And you just do not see this coming. In watching the play, you have no idea that this is going to come from anywhere, that a line like this is there in the play at all. Writing to a friend of hers, this is what Teresa Deevy described the play as. She said, "Well, it's a comedy." She said she marries Jim quite reconciled at last, that she's found passion in his persistent affection, and so can imagine herself as the heroine of a possible tragedy. A strange way to think of the play. I mean, it's not a reading of the play that would occur to you, certainly didn't occur to me reading it, as somebody who's just simply watching the play or reading the play. But this was very much how she saw it. Writing to a radio producer a number of years later, she says more or less the same thing. Being a romantic, she says, Annie likes to picture herself in danger. So what does this tell us? That here's this play where what we see happening on stage is slightly at odds with what's going on in the character's mind. That we have an intimation of it. We have a sense that here's this character on stage, but we are not quite sure what's going on in their minds. Her best-known play, Deevy's best-known play, is a play called Katie Roach, which was staged at the Abbey in 1936. It was actually restaged. The Abbey revived it in 1994. It's a play, again, about a woman who has no choices, or is faced with two very difficult choices. There's a younger man that she's attracted to and is full of life, but who's poor, and an older man who's very stern, very strict, but is very secure, well off, and stable. At the end, she marries the older man, but we think, that we know she doesn't love him. There's a very curious moment in that play where the character Katie Roach goes around the set and takes all the pictures that are on the wall and turns them around to face the wall. And it's this fascinating sort of image of somebody who is living with other people, interacting with other people, but is at some level cut off from them. At some level, not quite connecting.